He was one of the 2 salaries coming into the community, and the other one was railroad. One year he built me a car. He had a gasoline engine and 4 bicycle tires, and I could drive all the way around the block in it. And that was the one thing Monty Denham didn't have that I did have. But I remember my Aunt Georgia coming into the house and looking at, sort of shouting, "Who's Stella Jean?" she said. Somebody just ran by saying Stella Jean drowned.
So you lived next to the Denham Hotel?
No, there was the Falgren store, which was Windhorn's originally, and then the drugstore, and then something, there's a picture of it there someplace, a blank there, and then the Northern Bar attached to the cocktail lounge, and then the hotel, and then the space where the original bandstand was set. And then the bank building was not a bank, it was the Jacobs restaurant when I was growing up. Mrs. Jacobs and Mrs. Gasper were sisters.
So you were going from the north to the south?
No, I just went from the, north to the south. Which is not from here to here, but from here to here.
So they lived in the house in the corner that's not the gun shop, but the next one north of there, the old post office.
And that last picture that I saw, not dated, didn't have that second building there. I always thought the second building was the Kent building. But the one the post office is in is the Kent building. And Nels Kent had the store there, and he was Penny's great-grandfather.
Okay. So it was south of the Northern Hotel?
No, it was the Northern Hotel.
That's right.
Okay.
The Denhams took that over. Did they have a hotel before they took that one over? Do you remember?
Jay Denham came in. He and his wife, Effie, came in with the Great Northern and put up a little store, restaurant, feeding house up by the railroad. And the Great Northern sort of hired them, so there was some place to feed the passing. But they came in, put up this eating house, and Jay died. And he was the first one buried in the cemetery.
So you lived in what I call the old post office.
Right.
The white building that Ryan's owned. And you're saying it was the Nels Kent store?
Yes.
Okay.
And I found recently, going through papers, the papers that there's a letter from Kent to my dad, who had just bought the building. And Kent had put some money into the water system and suggested very subtly that maybe my dad would like to help with that. I'm not sure that would have gone over. That was in 30, he bought it in 38, which is when and then refinished the apartment behind it, our home, and the post office building in the front of it, with no door between. And I think that was a regulation.
Oh.
But in doing this, he could rent the post office to the U.S. Post Office Department.
They had to have that security, huh? There couldn't be that access to the office.
I've never heard that, but I'm just thinking about it. It makes sense That was the reason.
When you were saying no door between, I thought you meant no door that could be shut, and you were saying no door that could be open.
That's more to the point, yes. But that was when, and I'm not sure right now, when he went into the post office, it was a political appointment. And that is a history you would not believe.
So explain that.
When Grandpa Rudder went in as the postmaster in 1913, he was appointed. The post office boxes, those green ones, were owned by the postmaster. But with every election, the party that had won the election named every postmaster in every little town in every state in the United States. And as soon as the party changed, the postmasters changed. And Dad told me at one time that the post office boxes that he owned, that we still have now because they stopped owning them privately, were the ones that Harry Rudder bought in the first place, and Gillette bought from Harry Rudder, and then whatever the progression was, my dad bought from the last postmaster, but after he got in, they put civil service in. So instead of the political connection, it was more, he had to take a civil service exam to keep the post office job.
So did he have that job while it was still an appointment?
Yes, he went in 1934. And I'm not sure if it was 38 or the 42 election that they put in. I think possibly it was after Roosevelt got in that they moved it into the civil service. But in the meantime, there's that whole collection of letters from people pulling for one person or another person, telling who was working underneath so who would not get in or out.
Wow.
And that would make a history in itself.
For who gets to be postmaster?
Right, well, just the political under. I'm sure they aren't any worse than they are now.
Yeah, but I can't imagine that being part of the Postal Service. That must have been so disruptive. Every 4 or 8 years, all of a sudden, every postmaster is uprooted. You have to start all over.
And every small town had a strong Democrat and a strong Republican backing. So the Democrats knew who they wanted appointed, and so did the Republicans. And one of the letters is from one of the hotels in Washington, D.C. They're letters from Burton K. Wheeler announcing that we are happy to announce that.
And the post office used to be, well, they still are very responsible for money and responsible for the transportation of payrolls, and
I guess that's probably why it was so important, kind of to have your people on the end.
Well, that was one of the things, but my dad told me one time, I don't remember how we got into the discussion, but I was wondering, we didn't grow up feeling poor. We didn't grow up feeling rich, but we were not as desperate as the people who had come in from the North Country and South Country.
the farms during the Depression.
During the Depression. And what he said was that he was one of the 2 salaries coming into the community, and the other one was railroad. So at least he had that security. And I would say in the early years, from 1900 until after the Depression, that paid job was probably very, very good to have. And the people that a party would back were people who needed a job.
So your father was postmaster,
Right.
and your mother worked there too.
She was a clerk. And they usually tried to have other clerks available. Like when I went to college, it cost $24 round trip to come home. So we didn't come home too often. But in the middle of the fall quarter one year, they had me come home to take a postal exam so they could put me on as a clerk if they needed, because it was very, the reason the two of them were there was because they could depend on being able to, if something happened to one of them, the other was there. And with the clerk, it was, just pick, if you feel like coming today. It wasn't, the postmaster wasn't in command of saying when a clerk would come in. It was more up to the clerk if she felt like it that day. And by having the two of them there, they knew they could depend on one or the other. But it also meant that both of them never, with the four daughters, ever was able to attend a college graduation for one of them, because one of them had to be there. And it was that dependability, I think, that kept that going.
So was the post office job, did it require more than one person at a time? Like now there's just one. Was there more male at that time? Obviously there were more people.
The workload wouldn't have required more time. It was the time, it had to be open from one time to another. And that meant that they needed people that would be there at that time. But there were times when there were 2 or 3 different people listed as the, don't remember what the name, it was a certain type of clerk. And they could have 3 on the list for that clerk and call any one of them at a time. And I think most of the time Mother was one of the 3. When I came home during the summer, they could get away together over a weekend if I was going to be there. But they had to know they could depend on that. And the one thing that they absolutely could not depend on was my relationship with numbers.
Oh.
And every single night. And you could go down, you counted everything, there had the form there, they put the numbers down, and mine never came out the same. Just absolutely. But my dad would come in and I say we're $4.34 off. He said, "Did you count the duck stamps?" As soon as he heard the amount, they sold the fishing stamps through the post office. The stamps were in the drawer. And as soon as he heard the amount that I was off, he knew exactly what it was off. But there wasn't really enough work in the post office to keep. You put the mail out in the morning, you had to be there all during the day. And that's one of the other things. He ended up doing a lot of things in town. I found a note, all excited. It was in, I suppose, a day book or a diary. It had been my birthday, and I got a new bike. It was yellow. And I never in my life had a new bike, but anybody who had a part to a bike would bring it up to Stubbs. And he could sit there on that side door that still comes out of there and have all these parts for the bikes, and he would build bikes. So every kid in town always had a bike, and my image of myself as a child in Hinsdale is roaring up the streets on a bike. I never did walk well. That was way too slow. And running was a little bit, but you could go on a bike all day long from one end of town to another. But there were always bikes available, and he could put pieces together that worked for everyone. But one year he built me a car. He had a gasoline engine and 4 bicycle tires and put a seat from an old something on it, and this engine was in back, and I don't think I ever learned to build or to start the engine, but he could start the engine and I could drive that. There was nothing to it except no cover, no body to it, but there was the steering wheel, and that turned these bicycle tires beautifully, and he'd start the engine and I could drive all the way around the block in it. And that was the one thing Monty Denham didn't have that I did have. Monty always had a horse. But Monty Denham got in my car and drove it and turned the corner too fast, and the bicycle tires all collapsed. And that was the end of the car. He never rebuilt it for me. If I was going to lend it to boys, that was out of his line. But the other thing that he did do, Mother was due in the office every summer afternoon about 3, and he would start the coupe up. And as soon as the car, okay, some of my grandchildren have never heard the term coupe, but he would start the coupe up and head for the river. And every kid in town had his swimming suit hanging at the back door where he could just grab it, yell at his mother, "Stubbs is going to the river," and that was swimming. And every child in town learned to swim. And if you talk to David Hillman about Stubbs and his swimming lesson. But there was a group of older boys, the Seeley boys and the Burns boys. They were older and they were good swimmers. But my group learned to swim down on those summer trips to the river.
Everybody except
Stella Jean, whose father was afraid to let her go. And for some, my dad always felt, I won't say he would have felt guilty about it, because it would have been available there, but he just felt so badly about it, because that, you know how she drowned.
no.
We had a rope that came down, you could reach it, standing on the ground, and you'd back up and you'd run out with the rope and then let go and go into the water. Well, Stella Jean wasn't allowed to learn to swim, but it was I suppose such a pull for her to do what the other kids were doing. But she and Joanne were there alone. When she went out and just sort of froze, I heard her afterwards, and slipped off the rope and drowned. And I remember, and things like that you remember. There's just something in your mind. But I remember my Aunt Georgia coming into the house and looking at, sort of shouting, "Who's Stella Jean?" she said. Somebody just ran by saying Stella Jean drowned. And of course my dad left right out there then.
So was Georgia living with you then?
Well, she must have been there that day. She spent a lot of time, she taught in Glasgow and came out a lot during the summers.
So Stella Jean's last name?
Miller.
And Joanne's last name?
Nelson.
Okay.
And Stella Jean's mother, I have heard since, was a Pippin from Saco, from that family, but I don't know that, but it wouldn't be hard to check. I'm sure that family would remember it as well as I do.